Okay, welcome to this episode of Kescast. Freddie and Ben are going to be debating whether Macbeth is a willing murderer. Let's go.
Okay, so I believe that in Macbeth is an unwilling murderer. He doesn't really want to commit the murder. I think that a huge part, the main part behind him, like the main force compelling him to commit this murder, is the influence of Lady Macbeth and the witches.
So, I think quite the opposite. I think that there is some subconscious part within him that would like to commit this murder, as he is so easily convinced by Lady Macbeth and the witches. And we are shown, even before he has his pivotal, if you could say it that way, conversation with Lady Macbeth, that he does have these black and deep desires that he wants to try and hide, which could be letting us in on the fact that he wants to murder Duncan before Lady Macbeth has convinced him to.
Okay, so...
Yeah, because Freddie as well, you said the main part, mostly, which suggests not all.
Yeah, not all, definitely. I mean, I think
so what's
everybody...
the rest?
I think everyone with ambition has some part within them, an undeniable part, fundamental part within them that will want to seize upon that ambition. I think that amount of want to seize the ambition is different between people, and I think in this play, Macbeth he has this ambition, obviously, Lady Macbeth says he does, but another crucial part out of that quote, which I think off the top of my head is something like, I fear thy nature, thou hast the ambition, but not the illness to attend it. Lady Macbeth recognises that Macbeth has the ambition, but Lady Macbeth states clearly that she doesn't believe that Macbeth actually would want to take the role as king and actually, kill the king. I think this is further backed up in a quote, like Lady Macbeth, I had a train of thought and I've completely forgotten it.
That's okay. Do you want to continue or do you want to throw over to Ben for a minute?
Can I throw over to you while I think? I completely forgot my train of thought.
So, this whole thing of ambition, it's obviously seen as Macbeth's hamartia. And you see this as, he's already Thane of Glamis, and then he gets the title of Cawdor, and obviously after the premonition of the witches, of saying, Glamis thou art, Cawdor thou shalt be, and then king, he thinks, is this the next step? And he makes that decision to try and become king from the premonition that he's got, because events are lining up in the way he is. So this vaulting ambition is making him perform these acts, not just the forces of Lady Macbeth and the witches.
Okay, rebuttal. I've remembered my point.
Okay,
pull
it back.
There's a quote... Yeah, we'll edit this bit out, clearly. There's a bit at the beginning of the play with the captain describing this battle that Macbeth's been in. Quotes Macbeth, disdaining fortune. These two words are, I think, fundamental to why he's not a willing murderer. He has this ambition, clearly, like I said before, with Lady Macbeth recognising that, but he doesn't necessarily act on it, even if provoked, which clearly he has been. To disdain something, you have to be provoked to perhaps do it. And because of this, I think he's definitely been tempted by whatever's happened, but in the first place he hasn't taken it, which for me proves that he's not really... He has the ambition, but the part within him that wants to take it, there's just not enough of it there. I think, furthermore, about how Macbeth decides to start pursuing his want of kingship after interacting with the witches. The witches definitely provoke that within him, but I think something important to note is the influence that the witches are shown to have. They have their language seeps into the language of mortals within the play, such as "I'll do and I'll do and I'll do." That's a quote from one of the witches. Macbeth constantly, without fail, it's always like, for example, if it were done when 'tis done. There you go, that's the one. If it were done when 'tis done. These leakages, they prove to me the influence that the witches have. So I think perhaps, maybe not, I think that the witches definitely have an impact on Macbeth's mental state, but I feel like you could definitely argue, and there's a clear argument for, that they sort of control it in a way. They can directly influence his actions, which I think is a fundamental reason as to why Macbeth is initially unwilling.
Okay, so but going back to your point on this whole disdaining fortune thing, we see directly after that scene, Macbeth and Banquo meeting the witches, who are seen in the play as kind of portents of fortune or goddesses of destiny, and Macbeth, who is supposed to be disdaining towards this fortune and these predictions of the future, completely hooks on to what they're saying, even when it comes to the end, is demanding them to say more. He's blinded by what they're telling him.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. That's what I mean when I say that the witches have this influence directly sort of into his mindset. It's like they're editing with his mind and with his thoughts and with his rationale, sort of directly in the sense, because we know that they have the power to, based on their linguistic leakages. Another one, yeah. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Macbeth immediately says after that, so fair and foul a day I have not seen. They clearly have a lot of power, and I think that they do use this power to directly meddle with Macbeth's rationale, which is why Macbeth initially commits the murder, or at least is a huge part as to why he commits the murder.
So you're saying like they're kind of meddling with and changing his mindset, but that could also be seen as they are taking something that's normally in the back and pulling it more towards the front. There's the whole thing of under hypnosis, you can't make someone do what they wouldn't normally want to do. So to do something, you have to be really convinced by something to the extent of murder. You have to have that base desire to want to do it in the first place. And then also, with what you said about just then that I reacted to, and now I can't remember what you said.
Was it the leakages?
After that,
having a nice little loss of memory.
Yeah, Jesus.
It's the final Friday of year 11. Come on, give us some slack.
And
is it okay? Do you want to try and chase the thought, or should I throw something new in?
Throw something at Freddie.
Okay.
Chase.
We both have one memory loss now. Yeah, it'll do.
One for one.
So I saw a quote.
I
saw a quote during the week. I think it was by John Vivian, who said that the reason, the thing that sort of characterises Shakespeare's tragic characters, and sort of makes him care for his characters, makes us care for his tragic characters, is not that they are good, which, you know, like Greek tragedy, like characters in Greek tragedy, they were good characters placed in tragic, unfortunate situations. And John Vivian argued that Shakespeare's tragic characters aren't good, but they could have been. And that's what makes them tragic in their particular way.
Every single one of Shakespeare's tragic characters begins as someone who is kind of morally right and in most cases a hero, and his tragedies always hinge on the corruption of that. So Macbeth, obviously, with his ambition, Othello, jealousy, King Lear, his greed, kind of.
So surely if Macbeth's goodness has been corrupted, he had to be good in the first place, and then what's corrupted that was in the witches. Something else we haven't mentioned actually is Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth plays a huge part, an absolutely monumental part of this, of the reason why Macbeth wants to commit this murder. She knows exactly what Macbeth's weakness is. She's a complete contrast to a typical Jacobean woman. She knows that if she talks about his masculinity, she will get through to him in a way that not many others will. Such as I think it's after the murder of Banquo, and Macbeth is seeing the ghost of Banquo at the banquet. Lady Macbeth pulls Macbeth aside and says, "Are you a man?" These are fundamentally why I believe, because Lady Macbeth has a huge influence on Macbeth. She, in a sense, could be a fourth witch, because she also has linguistic leakages into Macbeth. She talks about like child imagery, and then Macbeth picks this up and further uses child imagery in his own speech. So I think the combination of the witches and Lady Macbeth are not the sole reason, but definitely a huge part of the reason as to why Macbeth committed this murder. Yeah,
okay.
exactly.
I'm just gonna jump in here.
Oh my goodness,
And
Miss Barton's got a point.
It's a special episode here.
It's a very special episode. So I think something that Macbeth does as a whole play is it makes us realise how plastic people's characters and personalities are. So we see how he's so influenced by Lady Macbeth. We see how the witch's language seeps into his everyday conversation. But also, to go back to what you were saying earlier about a sense of what a character could have been, that's incredibly important in Macbeth, because more than any other play, if you search for instances of subjunctives, moments where if this had happened, if it were done, 'twere well it were done quickly. Macbeth is always considering all these possibilities being laid open. His problem is that he doesn't want to choose.
To be or not to be.
Exactly. He just wants the end
One or
goal.
the other.
Exactly.
Neither.
He wants things to be done for him. And also a sense of performance in Macbeth, which we see through imagery like the robes. So, for example, putting on the robes, why do you dress me in borrowed robes? Sense of putting on and assuming this power, assuming a particular role. Are you a man? Think that
in the same way Lady
like
Macbeth says, "Unsex me here," because she doesn't want to fulfil the female role.
Excellent.
It's a direct appeal to
there's a bit we're cleaving apart, we're separating characters from we are unseeming. So we're seeing how all this imagery combines. We're separating what a character is from how they appear and how they act, and that leads us into very dangerous territory, because Macbeth doesn't know which way he wants to go. He doesn't know which imagery should he cleave to. How should his language, whose form should it take? All Macbeth knows in his own language is blood. That's the imagery that he feels confident with. That's his own.
Multitudinous seas and Carnadine.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what he believes his influence and role in the world is. That's what his actions will lead to. And I think that plasticity of character is really important with Macbeth. I'll leave you to it.
Oh, guest appearance from Miss Martin.
So, going back to your point on when Lady Macbeth is saying about... Thank you. When Lady Macbeth is saying about Macbeth's masculinity with Banquo, and she says, "Are you not a man?" And...
Mr. Temple's at the door.
And this is, I think, the first and possibly the only time that Macbeth actually rebukes Lady Macbeth, and he says something along the lines of, it is such a devil that a man would fear it. And he contradicts her at this point. So is that showing that he's escaped her, Paul?
That he does have some agency?
Yeah.
I think, is this before or after the murder? Sorry, I lost
This is after the murder.
Well, yeah, it's after the murder. It's after this event has happened. Of course, he might pull away then, because
it's regret and guilt.
Yeah, exactly. Macbeth is constantly plagued by guilt in this latter half of the latter half of the play, after he's murdered Duncan. This guilt is definitely there to begin with as well, because his body is out of his control. His body's physically repulsing the idea of murdering Duncan. His hair doth unfix, and my heart does beat against my chest. These are visceral images at the beginning of the play, or towards the beginning of the play, after the idea of killing Duncan's been put to his mind. These images clearly proved to me the goodness that is in Macbeth at the beginning of the play, which is then, like you said, in a Shakespearean tragedy, it's corrupted. So I think definitely the huge influence that Macbeth's emotions have on him, we all know, ambition may be one of his fatal flaws, but definitely so is his imagination and emotions. Of course he's going to feel guilty, because it's not something that was intrinsically in him to murder a king. It's not something he really wanted to do, I think. So, of course he's going to pull away from Lady Macbeth. Another example of him pulling away from Lady Macbeth is where he murders Banquo and doesn't tell Lady Macbeth that he's done that. So, I think there's definitely a plausible explanation for Macbeth disagreeing and contradicting Lady Macbeth, still for the argument that Macbeth is an unwilling murderer.
Well, okay, but then I think we also have to consider the context of this.
Right.
Because Shakespeare obviously wrote for his time, and there are many references in all of his plays to current events. In the instance of Macbeth, there's obviously references to the gunpowder plot, equivocation, the religious conflict that was going on. So Shakespeare presenting Macbeth as a willing murderer then makes his downfall even more appealing, because we see him as someone who was willing to commit these acts. Then when he gets taken down by Macduff and Malcolm, he's then seen to be almost, it's a karma.
Yeah,
in a sense,
that's true,
which would appeal to especially
King
the ruling
James.
monarch King James, who was extremely paranoid about regicide
and witches,
and
as well.
witches
He's
as well.
obsessed.
So this downfall that is then brought to Macbeth is amplified by the fact that he has his own agency in the murder. Because if it's just Lady Macbeth and the witches, and they're forcing Macbeth to do it, then, at least for the time, it would seem as if Macbeth was almost innocent if we say that it was just Macbeth and Lady Macbeth and the witches, which would then bring up even more questions with James I about what are you doing?
That is true. No, that's a good point. I think the thing is, I think if Macbeth, crikey. I think personally, if Shakespeare set out to make Macbeth a willing murderer, I don't think he succeeded. Obviously, it's a big thing to say about, one of the most acclaimed playwrights in the world. But I think if he really wanted to make Macbeth a willing murderer, if he wanted to set that plain and clear, he would have, because he definitely could have. He's one of the most famous playwrights in the world. He could definitely do something like that. He could have said, I wanted to kill Duncan, I wanted to take his command. And then the downfall after that would seem a lot more satisfying. But I think one of the key, sort of like a fundamental part of Macbeth is how ambiguous it is at the beginning, whether Macbeth wants to murder Duncan. And I think Shakespeare definitely did that on purpose, to make it ambiguous, to say, you could go one way or you could go the other, whether he was willing or unwilling. But I think if he could have made it really obvious that Macbeth was willing, he could have made it really obvious that Macbeth was unwilling, and I think he leaned more towards the latter. Because if you think about it, a lot of the people that were going to watch his play, they're not all King James, they're not all highly educated, they probably don't even understand what half of it really means.
Yeah. So then they would have seen guy stabs king, therefore guy wanted to stab king. So most of the people in the pit, say, who were just watching it for the action, would have seen Macbeth as a murderer because he was the one who committed the act.
Yeah, but that's people watching it for the action. I think
Which most people were.
Yes, but at the same time, I feel like he didn't make it obvious enough to begin with. Like, Shakespeare could have made it a lot more obvious as saying, Macbeth's definitely willing to do this, which he just didn't do.
I think the main argument we're trying to make is there's a lot more complexity to
Exactly.
all of the characters in Macbeth.
It's not just a black and white, Macbeth was willing to do this.
Of course. It's the whole life's but a poor player that struts and frets his hour on the stage. They're going backwards and forwards. They are kind of fretting really thinking about it. And it's not, again, full of sound and fury signifying nothing. It's not meant to be this big black and white thing. It's meant to be ambivalent, which is, again, brings it back to this central imagery, appearance and reality. Even the moral of the play isn't solidly defined.
Okay. I think that's a great point to end on, actually. Are we happy with that?
Yeah?
Yeah?
I'm pretty happy.
We could probably go on forever.
Yeah,
but-
it's probably, to be honest.
Okay. Well done, guys. That's good.